Good evening, my name's Steph Pike, I'm chairing the meeting tonight. Welcome to this Counterfire meeting on a brief history of Palestine. I mean, as we know from the news, the past few months, anti-Semitism has been used as an excuse to attack the Corbyn project. And this meeting is very timely. With the news, I don't know if people have seen, but Tower Hamlets Labour councillors yesterday voted unanimously for a Tory motion to adopt the IRHA. So with that in mind, I'll just make the statement that Israel is a racist endeavour. And I hand over to Shabbir Lakha, who is an anti-war and Palestine solidarity activist. He's also a fantastic writer, so we're very lucky to have him speaking on this subject tonight. Shabbir will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and there'll be plenty of chance after that to make contributions, ask questions, and if after that you feel inspired to join Counterfire, which is a fantastic socialist organisation, revolutionary organisation, you can join over at the back at the table, which also has books that you can buy if you fancy that. So I now hand over to Shabbir.
Thank you for that introduction, Steph. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So as Steph already said, if we didn't already know, then the news this summer, what's been used to attack Jeremy Corbyn, shows that Palestine is still very much the issue, and so it is a perfect time to be talking about Palestine. I'm sure a lot of people here will probably know roughly, or probably in detail as well, the history of Palestine and what's going on there, but it's always good to get a bit of a reminder and maybe learn some of the things which we didn't know about. So I'm going to try and just roughly go through the main events of the last 100 years, hopefully very briefly. And then, putting it into a context of what's happening today and what that means for British politics and for our activism. I think to start with, a good starting point is to know the origin of Zionist thought, which was in the late 19th century as a response to rising anti-Semitism across Europe. There were various different strands of Zionism. The idea was that Jewish people are persecuted in Europe and that they need a safe haven. There were different strands of Zionism which advocate for different things in this vein. But by the early 1900s, by about 1903, the World Zionist Organization made the settlement of the Jewish population, of a Jewish state in Palestine, central to Zionism, and it became the only acceptable proposition for Zionism. And it was on that basis that they were lobbying the British government and other governments to help them out. During the First World War between 1914 and 1918, the Ottoman Empire, which at that time occupied most of the Middle East, allied itself with Germany, and so became an enemy of Britain and the Allied powers. And as a result, what Britain did was it organized the Arab civilians living in the Middle East to revolt against the Ottomans, to help in the fight against the Ottomans, in return for the promise of their freedom. A lot of you might know the story of Thomas Edward Lawrence, who was sent as the British representative to the Middle East to make these promises to the Arab people. And in 1915, there was what was known as the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, where British diplomat essentially had a series of exchanges with Hussein, who's the Grand Sheriff of Mecca, basically promising the freedom for Palestinians in particular, should they help in the fight against the Ottomans. Now in 1916, Britain and France made a secret agreement which carved up the Middle East, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which essentially gave Syria, it was Greater Syria at the time, it's now Syria and Lebanon, to France, and Iraq, Jordan and Palestine mainly would be under British control. And the idea behind this was in part the competing imperialisms between Britain and France, but from the British perspective, it was very much about maintaining control of a larger part of the Middle East than France, but also a route for train link, which could provide infrastructure which would connect the Suez Canal to the Persian Gulf. So effectively, Britain occupied India would be connected through the Middle East to Egypt and North Africa, and the idea was trade and oil, and that would be secured by this agreement. Now, this agreement obviously went completely against what they'd been promising to the Arab people, which is why it was completely secret. However, in 1917, following the Russian Revolution, one of the first things that the new Bolshevik government did was to publish the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which they found somewhere among the Tsar's files, which obviously enraged the Arab peoples who didn't realize this was happening. And just prior, so this happened about 23rd of November in 1917, and earlier in November, on the 2nd, there was what was known as the Balfour Declaration, which was Britain's Foreign Secretary at the time made a formal declaration on behalf of the British government to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, this declaration went through many different drafts, and it was insisted upon that by the end it would explicitly mention that this Jewish homeland would not infringe upon the rights of the indigenous Palestinian population. This was despite the British government acknowledging that the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would require the dispossession of the Palestinian people. And there's a good book which I'm currently reviewing, although very lately, called The Balfour Declaration by Bernard Regan, where he looks at some of these cabinet meeting minutes and official documents which show these kind of considerations that British politicians were having, and how they acknowledged that this would be inevitable. But anyway, it was because of that caveat in the Balfour Declaration, it wasn't immediately taken as a negative thing. But following the publishing of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it became obvious that this was the intention of the Balfour Declaration, and that the Arabs were not going to be given their freedom. There was a series of revolts in Palestine at the time, largely quashed by Britain, who soon fully occupied the area after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And Britain began mass Jewish immigration from Europe to Palestine. Again, through the 20s and 30s, there were a number of uprisings by the Palestinians and also by the Jewish population who had settled there, who weren't happy with quotas on how many Jewish people could come, not being given the right to self-government just yet, etc. And this all kind of hammered the British forces there, which meant that following the Second World War, after depleting their resources in the war, they were unable to maintain their mandate of Palestine. The mandate, by the way, which had been given to them by the League of Nations that was formed after the First World War, was for the purpose of readying the Arabs for self-government, because they were backwards peoples who didn't know how to govern themselves, and therefore, Britain, shining hero, had to step in to do that. But obviously, by the point where Britain could no longer support its mandate, it was obvious that this wasn't happening anyway. So, in the meanwhile, the Zionists who were organizing the Jewish population that was now settling in Palestine were very careful in how they created the societies. One example of a way that they ensured what would happen later on was the Histadrut, which was set up as a Jewish trade union in Palestine, but it was set up as an exclusively Jewish trade union, which would not represent Palestinians. And in the 30s, when Palestinian workers went on strike in opposition to the British government, the Histadrut found Jewish employees to break that strike and work in their place so that the strike became ineffective. This organization went on later to become the second biggest employer in Israel after the Israeli government, and today continues to play a role in maintaining a labor force that is exclusive of Palestinians. Anyway, in 1947, the United Nations adopted the partition plan, This was after Britain first asked America to help them maintain their mandate. They asked for a commitment of, I think it was 100,000 American troops in Palestine, and America just laughed and said no way. And therefore Britain went to the United Nations, and the United Nations didn't know what to do. They took the recommendations from the Peel Commission in 1939, which showed that both Palestinians and Jewish people in Palestine were unhappy, and that possibly the only solution was a partition. So what they did was that they partitioned Palestine into about 56% and 42% of historic Palestine, where 56% would be the state of Israel, 42 would be Palestine, and Jerusalem would be internationally governed zone which was separate to both countries. The Palestinians rejected this deal, and civil war essentially broke out, which soon became known as the First Arab-Israeli War, after Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria got involved as well. Ultimately, Israel, bolstered by America and Britain, were able to win this war, and in pushing back the Arab armies, they essentially took over 78% of historic Palestine, which left what we know now today as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Both areas largely constituting of refugees, because Palestinians from other parts of Palestine were pushed into those areas. But the vast majority of the Palestinian population, which prior to this war was about 1 million, were pushed out of Palestine entirely. So this is over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled. This was by a process of intimidation and terrorism. You had over 500 Palestinian villages destroyed, and there was a very systematic process by groups like the Haganah and the Ergen, which were Jewish militias, to destroy a village, let a few of the people survive and make it to the next village, to let them know what happened and tell them that we're going to be going to that village the next day, etc. And so it eventually ended with 750,000 Palestinian refugees in neighboring Arab countries, mainly Syria and Jordan, a lot of whom still held on to the keys of their homes because they thought they'd be allowed to come back once the war was over. That obviously didn't happen, and in 1948, in May, Israel declared itself a state on that 78%. They signed an armistice agreement with Jordan and Egypt, and Syria in the north, where they gave the West Bank to Jordan. So the West Bank was under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian control. This was not an ideal situation for anyone really, and there was a lot of fighting, which ultimately led in 1967 to the Second Arab-Israeli War, where led by Egypt, other Arab armies again tried to invade Israel and rectify the situation in their eyes. This led again to America and Britain overnight supporting Israel, and Israel winning this war. At this point, they pushed out the Jordanians and the Egyptians completely and occupied the entire historic Palestine. They almost immediately commenced with settlement building in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and pushing in Israeli settlers to live there. In 1973, there was the Yom Kippur War. But in 1987 was when the first Intifada started. It was a non-violent uprising by the Palestinians against what they were facing. And it didn't end until 1993 with the signing of the Oslo Accords. Now, the Oslo Accords was, again, another secret agreement done through back-channeling by the PLO, which at that point was an illegal organization, was not allowed to be present in Palestine, was kicked out of various countries, Lebanon, Tunisia, etc. And if you saw the news over the summer about Jeremy Corbyn going to Tunisia, you know that the Israelis bombed the PLO in Tunisia. So this Oslo Accords was signed as a first stage to a peace process. And it was, again, very much done behind closed doors without the input of Palestinian or Israeli civilians. And it was done completely on the premise of goodwill on the side of Israel. The Oslo Accords split up the West Bank into three areas A, B, and C, which today is roughly, Area A is about 10%, B is about, I think, 15% or so, and Area C is about 60% of the West Bank. And now Area A is completely under Palestinian control. Area B is under Palestinian civil administration but under Israeli military control, and Area C is completely under Israeli control. The important thing to know about these areas as well is that the way they were carved up was not simply Area A is in one place, B is another, C is another. They were very much, Area A is small little areas encircled by Areas B, and Area C is cut by the areas, which basically created a system of Bantustanization, something which is a reference to South Africa and how the black indigenous population of South Africa were pushed into these small ghettos in certain parts of the country. The other thing that the Oslo Accords did was it allowed Israel full control of the borders between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. It allowed them to decide when these borders could be opened and closed based on their military interests. And importantly, there was the Paris Protocol, which was supposed to encourage economic cooperation between Israel and Palestine. But what it did was it institutionalized Israel's process of controlling the Palestinians from an economic perspective. So it allowed them the right to claim certain parts of Palestinian lands, coincidentally the most fertile areas in Palestine, assign them as military zones so that they can't be used by Palestinians, to take control over the water sources, to be the sole people in charge of electronic and telecommunication infrastructure. And this all, again, the key point was that it was based on Israel's military preferences, military interests. Also following the Oslo Accords, the World Bank got involved in trying to foster this economic cooperation and help the Palestinian economy grow as such. But there's a very good book by a guy called Tawfiq Haddad called Palestine Limited, which goes through about 100,000 documents from the World Bank and shows the kind of projects they put in place, which was basically a process of introducing neoliberalism into Israel, and it was a process of predetermining what would happen as a basis of what would happen following certain political decisions. I won't go into too much detail on that. It's a bit complex and I don't fully understand it myself, but you should read that book. What else? What we have with the settlements in the West Bank is that you have settlers who are allowed to stay in these areas of the West Bank illegally and treated as citizens of Israel, who have access to 3 times the water than Palestinians in the West Bank have, who have access to transport networks which Palestinians are not allowed to use, which are guarded by the Israeli military. This is, in complete violation of international law. One other thing I forgot to mention in terms of the economic cooperation was that the Paris Protocol set up a customs union between Israel and Palestine, which essentially meant that anything Palestine produces has to be sold by Israel, and Israel take the revenue from that and decide when they want to transfer it to Palestinians. And so we saw a couple of years ago when UNESCO decided to recognize Palestine as a member country of UNESCO, and Israel was very upset about this. They not only withdrew from UNESCO, but they froze some $2 million that was supposed to be going to the Palestinians, and just didn't give it to them for, I think, over a year. But also, this economic cooperation meant that they were in charge of giving permits to Palestinians for employment, because the Palestinian economy is basically non-existent, and it's meant that Palestinians are dependent on coming to Israel or working in the settlements. But post-Oslo, Israel was allowed to determine when these people received permits, and they could literally decide on any given day that today only males above 50 are allowed permits, and everybody else will wait at a checkpoint for 4 hours and then be sent home. There was also periods in the 90s and the early 2000s where there were full closures of the borders for weeks and months, when no Palestinians were allowed to move at all, which again meant the Palestinians had literally no income, unemployment was massive, etc. All of these things culminated in 2000 in the second Intifada, which this time was a violent uprising where Palestinians, some Palestinians took arms and took suicide bombings and the rest of it, which allowed Israel to then put into place extra security measures, such as the separation barrier, or the apartheid wall as we call it, which has been ruled illegal by the International Court of Justice. But also this wall is not on the border of the West Bank. It is some 90 kilometers inside the border of the West Bank. And so there's whole Palestinian villages which are trapped between the armistice line with Israel and the wall between the West Bank. And so you have people who live in one village who can't get to the village across the wall without going all the way around to a checkpoint at the south and then come back in. And anyway, all of this, what I'm trying to say is that it's economically destroyed Palestinians' hopes for living a normal life, and it's part of a process of humiliation and collective punishment of the Palestinians. So just a few more notes quickly, because I think, I'm running out of time. 2006, the population of Gaza elected Hamas. This was followed in 2007 by the imposition of a blockade, which has now gone on for 11 years and is one of the harshest sieges in human history. It has resulted in, for example, the water in Gaza being up to 95% unfit for human consumption. The siege is such that nothing can get in without Israeli permission, and there was documents which were revealed which showed that Israel had planned what could go in based on a careful caloric calculation of what would be just enough to stop the Palestinian population from being malnourished, basically. And they often use the excuse of Hamas trying to get into Israel to blow up secret tunnels, which Palestinians are now dependent on because they can't get access to other things. Since then, Israel has carried out 4 or 5 serious offensives in the Gaza Strip. Most notably, in 2008 and 2009, there was Operation Cast Lead, which was a full-on air and ground offensive, killed over 2,000 people, razed whole areas of the Gaza Strip to rubble, and there was the use of chemical weapons such as white phosphorus and depleted uranium, which has had long-lasting effects to this day. In 2012, there was Operation Protective Edge, and in 2014, there was another ground and air offensive called Operation Pillar of Cloud, which again led to over 2,000 people dead, of which over a quarter of them were children. So just to bring it to today, what's happening, we've seen in the last year that the United States President Donald Trump has decided to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem, which is in violation of international law. And at the same time as this embassy was being opened, peaceful protesters in the Gaza Strip were being shot down by snipers. These Palestinian protesters in Gaza have been part of the Great Return March, which has been going on since the end of March till now, and they're protesting every Friday at the fence with Israel. And till now, over 177 Palestinians have been killed. Almost 20,000 Palestinians have been shot. And among those people killed have been children and nurses and journalists. So that's what's happening now. Israel is continuing to increase its settlement building in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. It has plans very much to annex the entire East Jerusalem. And at the moment, they've got the approval of the Supreme Court and are waiting to demolish an entire camp of Palestinians called Khan al-Ahmar. So this is what's happening now. There's a lot more I can talk about in terms of administrative detention and child prisoners and and all kinds of things. But I think if I can just quickly bring it back to the crux of the matter, which is that Israel was created as a settler colonialist project. It was tied to British and US imperialism. In fact, a senior British general at the time said that the aim for creating Israel was to make it a Jewish Ulster. And this is what we're seeing today. And we see that the United States has created this nexus with Israel and Saudi Arabia, where they're gearing up for confrontation with Iran, and is very much a part of the imperialist project. The creation of Israel was dependent on the colonization of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinian people, and therefore it's fair to say that it is inherently racist. And as Steph said at the start, there is a racist endeavor. And why I think it's important to say that is because, as you have all known, the Labour Party was pushed into adopting the IHRA definition, which outlaws the use of saying this phrase on the grounds that it's anti-Semitic. And this is part of this wider attack on the Palestine Solidarity Movement and on Jeremy Corbyn and the left. Jeremy Corbyn, who's been a staunch supporter of Palestinian rights for most of his life. And Britain has had a proud history of Palestine solidarity. As much as our country has played such a terrible role in creating the situation in Palestine today, the people of Britain have played an equal role in resisting that and in trying to push our government to overturn that. And that is why Israel is doing what it can to influence British politics, to undermine the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Israel makes no efforts to hide the fact that it's pumping millions and millions into anti-BDS campaigns. There was a number of things that happened in the last year which showed the level of influence it's trying to achieve in British politics. There was the Al Jazeera expose, which showed embassy officials meeting with people in the Labour Party and other organisations to undermine Jeremy Corbyn, to remove at the time Mali Abouatia, who was the head of the NUS. You had Joan Ryan MP being given £1 million to undermine Corbyn, to use anti-Semitism as a tool, and all these things. We also had the affair with Priti Patel, where she was having secret meetings with the Israeli government and with Netanyahu himself, and was trying to find ways to divert international aid money to the Israeli military. So all of these things we should bear in mind and be aware of them as a danger to our activity, but also as a testament to how strong our movement is, and why it's so necessary for us here to carry on. Because what we do here does have a big impact in the global Palestine Solidarity Movement, and the fact that Israel is so afraid of what we're doing should tell us that. And just one final thing is that the other way that Israel is able to influence things here is the way our media operates. Some of you will have seen recently when a pregnant mother and her young child in Palestine were killed by an Israeli airstrike. The BBC put up a news report on this and were immediately tweeted by the Israeli foreign minister saying, "You need to change this headline now," and they did. And you know, it's not something new. You might remember in 2008 when the offensive was going on in Gaza. For the first time in about 40 years, the BBC refused to advertise the appeal of the DEC, which is for Gaza, and Tony Benn bravely went on and did it anyway. So all of these things we should bear in mind, and I'll leave it at that so we can have a discussion, and I'll just end with saying, long live Palestine.